Hello, class. Um, Welcome to video recording. This is this will be the last lecture that we do in class, or I guess this is the last lecture. We are not in class, and this will be the Batman lecture. So let's just go ahead and get started. Um, Before I start, if you have not seen Batman Begins, stop this lecture right now. Go watch it. It's on Netflix. It's on Amazon Prime. You can also rent it on iTunes. So um, go watch it and then come back. And just so you know, before I begin the lecture, I'm going to go over some concepts that relate to Batman, or psychological concepts that relate to some themes in Batman Begins. And then I'm going to go over an assignment for you guys to complete on Blackboard. Okay. So let's just go ahead and get started. Okay, so Pavlov. I want to talk about Pavlov. I think this relates to the theme of fear in Batman Begins. So if we were in class and we were watching Batman Begins, I would stop the movie um, at the point where Bruce Wayne falls into the well in the beginning of the movie. And I'll talk a little bit about Pavlov, and then hopefully it'll become clear why um, I stopped the movie there to talk about this. So Pavlov, he was a he studied the digestive system. His findings kind of triggered the birth of a class of psychology called behaviorism. And he had this new direction that he came across when he had this accidental observation. So he found that without fail, putting food in a dog's mouth caused the animal to salivate. Moreover, the dog began salivating not only at the taste of food, but also at the mere sight of food, or the food dish, or the person delivering the food, or even at the sound of the person's approaching footsteps. And at first, Pavlov considered these quote unquote psychic secretions an annoyance until he realized that it pointed to a simple but fundamental form of learning. And so we'll get into that, but Pavlov had this device for recording salivation. So he had this tube in the dog's cheek that collected saliva, which was measured in a cylinder outside the chamber. And so um, Pavlov wondered if a sight or sound regularly signaled the arrival of food, would the dog learn this link? And if so, would it begin salivating in anticipation of the food? And so I'm going to go over some concepts here in order to understand this example. So classical conditioning is a type of learning in which we learn to link one or two stimuli and to anticipate events on the basis of a stimuli. A neutral stimulus in classical conditioning is a stimuli that does not elicit a response before it is conditioned. And an unconditioned response is a natural occurring response, such as salivation, in response to the unconditioned stimulus, such as food. Okay, and the unconditioned stimulus is the stimulus that naturally and unconditionally automatically triggers that unconditioned response. But the salivation in response to the tone, however, is learned. Okay, it's conditional upon the dogs associating the tone with the food. Thus, we call that response the conditioned response. So, in this particular example, the unconditioned stimulus is the food because it causes a unconditioned response, the salivation in the dog. And then the neutral stimulus is this tuning fork. When it plays, it does not elicit any salivation. However, when you pair the tuning fork with the food enough times, eventually the tuning fork without the food causes the salivation. And in this example, after the tuning fork now creates salivation, the tuning fork now becomes the conditioned stimulus, and the salivation in response to the tuning fork becomes the conditioned response. Okay. And so the reason why I brought this up is because, Batman falls into the well and then he sees bats, right? And then he goes to the opera with his parents, and the people on stage remind Bruce Wayne of bats, and that scares him. And so, how can we use psychology, or this example specifically, to understand why Batman was scared of the bats? Well, in this case, the unconditioned stimulus would be Batman falling, and the unconditioned response would be fear. Okay? And the neutral stimulus would be bats, but would only be bats before the fall, right? Because normally, you know, we're assuming that Batman was not scared of bats before he fell into the well, right? So the bats alone would not produce any fear. However, Batman then fell into the well where he saw bats, right? And so the fall was paired with the seeing of the bats, right? And then so when he goes to the opera and he sees the bats now produce fear in Bruce Wayne, even though he didn't actually fall in that case, right? And so now the bat is the conditioned stimulus, and the fear and response to the bats is the conditioned response, right? And then another event happens that makes Batman even more scared of bats, and that is watching his parents die, right? And so, starting from the beginning, the unconditioned stimulus in that case would be his parents dying, and the unconditioned response is terror. And then the neutral stimulus, again, would be bats. I mean, the bats aren't necessarily neutral stimulus because he is still scared of them because he associates them with the fall. But it is neutral compared to the sight of watching his parents die, right? And then so when you pair the bats with the memory of his parents dying, he now becomes conditioned to be incredibly fearful of the bats, and the bats alone cause terror, right? Because he's conditioned to associate the bats not only with the prior fall, but also with watching his parents die. Okay. And so that's one example that I went over. And now, you guys, now I want you guys to do this example on your own, and I want you to post your reactions or your responses in a Blackboard post on Blackboard. So the main thrust of this lecture was I wanted to know if Batman had PTSD as a result of watching his parents die. So PTSD refers to anxiety suffered long after traumatic events has occurred. And so, and there are some criteria for PTSD. Okay. And what I want you to do is to address each one of these criteria yourselves and comment on whether you think that Batman has PTSD based on whether he meets these criteria. So the first criteria for having PTSD is trauma. Did the event that led to Batman becoming Batman involve trauma? And in this case, we're talking about watching his parents die. So you have to decide whether that involved trauma. And then the second criteria, criteria B, is there persistent re-experiencing? Okay, and so basically, is Batman still having memories of watching his parents die? Is it kind of butting into his conscious life, and is he re-experiencing those emotions? Criteria C, is he, and so there are two elements to this. So persistent avoidance, and I gotta fix this, and emotional numbing. So is Batman engaging in persistent avoidance and emotional numbing in order to make himself feel better from that traumatic event? So persistent avoidance of memories and emotions, that kind of speaks for itself. But in terms of emotional numbing, it has four of its own components. So is he showing diminished interest and participation in significant activities? Does he feel detached or estranged from others? So does he feel isolated from others? Is he isolating himself, and are other people isolating him? Does he have a restricted range of emotions? So does he feel the full spectrum of all the emotions, like sadness, happiness, anger, grief, stuff like that? Does he have a sense of shortened future? So does he feel that there's not much left in his life? Okay. And so, these are questions that I want you to ask yourself and talk about in your post. So criteria D, does he have persistent symptoms of arousal that weren't present before the traumatic event, watching his parents die? Criteria E, you can kind of skip. Your answer to that question kind of depends on all the other questions. And Christ, actually, I'm gonna just delete criterion E. Yeah. In criterion F, does Batman experience significant distress of impairment in social, occupational, and other functioning? So is it difficult for him to engage in normal social activities, to be a good member at work, or in other ways? Okay, so now I want you to stop the recording and go and do your post, and then come back to this lecture where I will lecture some more. Okay, so welcome back. And so at this point, I will talk about, so it is my opinion that Batman at the point at the end of the movie, I don't think that Batman is struggling from post-traumatic stress. Now, If you think that he is, it's totally fine. I'm not gonna deduct um, from your discussion post. As long as you addressed everything. But we're going to talk about why I think Batman was able to bounce back from his post-traumatic stress disorder. And so, let me delete this. So, to make sense of, just to say, to make sense of trauma, people often draw on one of three global conclusions. So they either think that people will get the justice they deserve for the trauma that they inflicted. There is no justice, or justice happens, but it needs our help. And so this would be a class discussion if you guys were in class, but you are not. So I'll just tell you what I think. I think that Batman was able to take advantage of that third point. Justice happens, but it needs our help. And so putting on the cape, donning the mask, going out there and fighting crime, allowed Batman to draw on this global conclusion that justice needs my help, and that was something that was able to help him get over the trauma and to not fully experience post-traumatic stress disorder. Social support also helped people bounce back. So Batman had many father figures such as Alfred Pennyworth, Commissioner Gordon, Lucius Fox, Henry Ducard, also known as Ra's al Ghul. And so I think having these kind of like father figures in his life who were able to spiritually guide him helped him bounce back from post-traumatic stress. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the neuroscience of fear, and in particular here I'm focusing on the scarecrow and his fear toxin and how it might have worked. Okay, and so I'm going to talk about some of these brain functions. So we have these older brain functions that are not very complex, and they just handle basic survival functions like the brainstem. It's the innermost brain region. The medulla, which is located on top of the brainstem, it controls heartbeat and breathing. And we have the pons that sits above the medulla and helps coordinate movement. And then we have these newer brain structures that are more complex, and they handle advanced functions that are built on the old. So we have the frontal lobe, sits behind the forehead, involved in speaking and muscle movement and in making plans and judgments. And then we have the parietal lobe, which is the portion of the cerebral cortex lying at the top of the head and toward the rear, and receives sensory input for both touch and body position. The occipital lobe is important for vision. The temporal lobe sits above the ear. It includes areas that receive information from the ear. And then we have, between the older and the newer areas lies the limbic system. Okay, and so limbus means border. So literally, borders the old and the new parts of the brain. And its neural systems include the hippocampus, which processes conscious memories. It's named for the Greek horse. The amygdala, which is involved in responses of aggression and fear. And the hypothalamus, which is involved in various bodily maintenance functions, pleasurable rewards, and control of the endocrine system. And so I want to specifically focus on the amygdala here, because I think that if this fear toxin that the scarecrow uses was real, then the amygdala is where it would be targeting. Okay, and so the amygdala, so amygdala means almond. It's like the size of, it's like the shape of what the amygdala actually looks like, a small almond. And it's linked specifically to aggression and fear, and so damage or removal to the amygdala results in reduced arousal to fear and anger arousing stimuli. And you can also stimulate the amygdala, and depending on the location of the stimulus, it'll either be an anger response or a fear response. So And so yeah, we're focusing on the amygdala here, so I can actually just get rid of the hypothalamus. And so yeah, that's all I got for you guys. So hope everyone's doing well in the projects. Um, this would have been a longer lecture. If we were in class, we would have had group discussions about each of these topics. We would have watched the movie, but unfortunately, we're not able to do that. So just make sure you do the discussion post. If you have any questions, let me know.